Imagine two people. One possesses 3.5 ounces of methamphetamines. The other has killed a man. The one who possessed an amount of meth about the size of a deck of cards receives life in jail without parole. The one who ended a human life gets 20 years. This cannot be possible, you say? Well, it has happened hundreds of times.
Committers of nonviolent crimes, especially drug-related crimes, have frequently received longer sentences.
Why? Because of mandatory minimums. So what are mandatory minimums?
Well, during the drug-crazed 70s and 80s, to catch those involved in the drug trade and to deter others from entering it, Congress and many state legislatures passed laws that forced judges to give strict, inflexible prison sentences to those convicted of certain crimes, most often drug offenses. At the head of these laws were primarily Presidents Nixon in the 1970s and Reagan in the 1980s.
Mandatory minimums are set amounts of time that need to be served in jail for committing a certain crime. As the number of offenses and amount of drugs increase, so does the mandatory sentence. No matter what specific circumstances occur, the offender will be required to serve at least the set amount of time.
But for many years in criminal justice, there's been kind of a lock them up and throw away the key approach. This notion that you just cut the government a blank check, you don't really care where the money is going or how these offenders are being handled.
Rebecca Nitkin, a defense attorney in Rockville, Maryland, commented on the inflexibility of mandatory minimums.
Unfortunately, to begin with, the state said they knew nothing about the case, nothing about the family, nothing about anything, and they just said, guns, drugs, mandatory 5.
Mandatory minimums cause 3 major problems. Judges can't consider the facts of each case. The type and weight of a drug primarily determines sentence length, and low-level offenders often get longer sentences than high-level dealers. Joyce Hens Green, a U.S. District Judge for the District of Columbia, said, "As a consequence of the mandatory sentences, we know that justice is not always done. You cannot dispense equal justice by playing a numbers game. Judgment and discretion and common sense are essential."
Let's talk numbers. The United States has only 5% of the world's population, but holds 25% of the world's prison population.
While the population has only grown by about a third since 1980, the federal prison population has increased by over 800%.
Each year, about 60% of all federal drug offenders are subjected to a mandatory minimum sentence.
A lot of cases involving mandatory minimums end unjustly. For example, on his first offense, Kevin Ott was found possessing a small bag of meth. On his second, he was caught growing marijuana. And on his final offense, he possessed 3.5 ounces of meth.
My name is Kevin Ott. My number is 203093. I'm in here for trafficking methamphetamine. I start my 14th year in just a couple of months, and I will be here until I die. Yeah.
Offenders are not the only ones affected by long prison sentences.
The general public also suffers from mandatory minimums in the form of taxes.
Taxpayers are spending an awful lot of money on locking up drug offenders for very long periods of time. That is requiring the Department of Justice to shift that funding away from victim services, from anti-terrorism, from cybersecurity, from even investigations of violent offenses, and to shift that money into the prison system to keep these nonviolent offenders locked up. Long prison sentences are devastating for families. You suddenly have spouses who lose a partner, children who lose a parent. You have families that lose a breadwinner often. Oftentimes we see the impact on children can be very serious. Children with parents who are in prison may start acting out in school, have more behavioral problems than children who have 2 parents in the home.
On average, it costs almost $29,000 to keep one person in federal prison for 1 year, and about $31,000 for state prisoners. With the amount of money we would save by not incarcerating so many people, we would be able to, hypothetically, provide free college education to all students.
However, some support these laws.
So when we've done this in the past, the prosecutors like to have mandatory minimum sentences. because they feel that it's a tool that can be used for putting in place tough sentences on people that are dealing drugs or things like that. So they've been the primary ones. I would think a lot of law enforcement would also support mandatory minimum sentencing. Those would probably be the two big advocates for it.
Yet, there is a mostly bipartisan agenda calling for reform.
We must end the over-incarceration of nonviolent young Americans who do not pose a serious threat to our society.
But even if we acknowledge we're going to punish people for bad behavior that hurts only themselves, it needs to be within reason, and it needs to be that we get people back into society and get them jobs.
By having a presumption for treatment instead of incarceration, we can help the incarcerated become beneficial members of society instead of allowing 25% of released prisoners to reoffend. Just like the United States Capitol building, our criminal justice system is in need of reconstruction.
So, 2016 presidential candidates, will you help reform our federal justice system, or will you take the mandatory minimum effort and do nothing?